Let me ask you something. How does a country collapse its currency, ignore textbook economics, alienate its allies, and still possibly survive? I'm talking about Turkey, a country I visited not long ago, and honestly, the experience left me fascinated and confused. Everywhere I went, Antalya, the bazaars, the beaches, life looked beautiful. Tourists smiling, shops full, the food just amazing. But beneath that surface, Turkey is playing a high stakes economic game, one that the world is watching but few people truly understand. This is about a country at the crossroads of East and West, and led by a man who is trying to reshape not just Turkey's economy but its entire identity. What exactly is Erdogan doing? Why is Turkey making such risky economic decisions? And more importantly, can this gamble actually work? Let's find out. Turkey is a country that's always been split, not divided, but split by geography, by culture, by history. One foot in Europe, one foot in Asia, a Muslim majority country with a secular constitution, a NATO member that buys weapons from Russia, a democracy with one man increasingly calling the shots. And if you have ever visited Istanbul, you'll feel this tension instantly. You'll walk across a bridge and literally cross continents. But this split isn't just about culture, it shows up in Turkey's economy too. Because Turkey has always tried to blend Western capitalism with local control. And for years, it kind of worked. The early 2000s were a golden period. Turkey opened up, foreign investment poured in, construction boomed, the lira was strong. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty. But that growth came with a cost. Most of it was built on cheap foreign debt, rising imports, and mega infrastructure projects that didn't always make sense. It was a bubble, not unlike what we have seen in other emerging markets, except Turkey added something else into the mix: politics. Recep Tayyip Erdogan isn't just Turkey's president, he's the most dominant Turkish leader since Atatürk. And over the last 2 decades, he has gone from reformer to strongman. But what makes Erdogan unique is his complete rejection of how modern economics is supposed to work. Here is what I mean. When inflation rises, most governments raise interest rates to cool it down. But Erdogan, he says interest rates are the mother of all evil. So as Turkey's inflation soared past 80% at one point, he cut interest rates again and again. Why? Because Erdogan believes lower interest rates will drive production, exports, and growth no matter what the textbooks say. He also thinks high interest rates are a part of a global conspiracy to keep Muslim countries weak. It's a radical theory, but it's one he has stuck with even as the lira collapsed and foreign investors ran. And here's the thing, despite the chaos, Erdogan keeps getting re-elected. Why? Because for many Turks, especially outside the big cities, he's a symbol of strength, identity, and resistance to Western domination. It's not about inflation, it's about pride, power, control. And Erdogan knows how to use that. But you see, pride doesn't pay for groceries, and this is where the cracks start to show. Since 2018, the Turkish lira has lost over 80% of its value against the dollar. And that's insane. It means everyday Turks have seen their savings evaporate. Imported goods became unaffordable, and young professionals are leaving the country. And while inflation has cooled a bit recently, it's still sky high. I spoke to people in Antalya who told me they used to afford small luxuries, a meal out, new clothes, a weekend trip. Now they're just trying to keep up with rent and bread. But here's the paradox. Tourism is booming because for foreigners, especially Europeans, Turkey is now cheap. You can stay in 5-star hotels, eat like royalty, and spend a fraction of what you would in Italy or France. So the economy keeps moving, but at 2 speeds. For tourists and elites, opportunity; for locals and workers, anxiety. And Erdogan, he keeps reshuffling the central bank, printing new narratives and pushing his vision. But the question is, how long can it last? So now we shift from economics to geopolitics. Because if you really want to understand Erdogan's gamble, you can't just look at what Turkey is doing with money. You have to look at where Turkey sits and how it plays everyone. Literally. Turkey is in NATO but buys Russian S-400 missiles. It sends drones to help Ukraine fight Russia but refuses to sanction Russia. It trades heavily with Europe but threatens to open the refugee floodgates if the EU crosses it. It calls itself a champion of Muslim nations but maintains ties with Israel when it suits its interests. Turkey doesn't follow the script, it writes its own. And this goes far beyond diplomacy. Because Erdogan sees foreign policy not just as survival but as legacy. Now, as someone with the roots from India, I'll be honest, there was a moment that hit differently. During the height of the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir this year, Turkey openly backed Pakistan. Not quietly, not diplomatically, Erdogan stood up at the UN and criticized India by name. That's not easy to overlook. Especially when you see Turkey as a beautiful, welcoming country and then realize it is taking such a public stance against yours. But here is what I've come to understand. Turkey's foreign policy is deeply shaped by identity, not just Muslim identity, but this vision of Turkey as the protector, the voice, the balance. Sometimes it supports Palestine, sometimes it speaks for Uyghurs in China. Sometimes it turns a blind eye when the trade is good enough. It's not about loyalty, it's about positioning. Erdogan wants Turkey to be indispensable to Russia, to the West, to the Muslim world, to everyone and to one all at once. That's why you'll see Turkey mediating peace in Ukraine while fighting Kurds in Syria, hosting NATO bases while blocking NATO expansion. It's messy, it's contradictory, and yet it's working. Because while other nations chooses sides, Turkey chooses leverage. It doesn't need to be trusted by everyone, it just needs to be needed. Now here is where it gets even more interesting and maybe a little dangerous. There's a phrase you'll hear whispered among Turkey watchers, neo-Ottomanism. It sounds dramatic, but it's not fiction. Erdogan has increasingly styled himself as the heir to the Ottoman legacy. Not as a sultan, but as a strongman who puts Turkey back at the center of global power. It's in the way he speaks, the way he frames Turkey's destiny, and even in the way Turkey is expanding its presence abroad. You might not know this, but Turkey now has military bases in Qatar, Somalia, northern Syria, and Iraq. It has signed deals with African countries. It trains soldiers, builds mosques, and opens Turkish schools far beyond its borders. This isn't colonialism, not in the old sense. It's soft power with a hard edge. And at home, the signs are everywhere. The Hagia Sophia, once a church, then a museum, has been reconverted into a mosque. School curriculums emphasize Ottoman history, and Erdogan's own party often uses language about reclaiming Turkey's historic mission. Now, whether you see that as visionary or dangerous depends on where you stand. Some see it as Turkey rising, taking pride in its heritage, punching above its weight on the global stage. Others see it as authoritarian, nationalism wrapped in religion and nostalgia. What's undeniable is this: Erdogan doesn't just want Turkey to survive, he wants it to lead, not as a Western democracy, not as a Middle Eastern ally, but as something entirely its own. A nation that remembers it was once an empire and acts like one again. Can this economic gamble survive? Can Erdogan defy global economic logic, upend geopolitical alliances, and still keep Turkey stable, growing, influential? Right now, it's too close to call. Inflation is still high, but slowing. The lira is weak, but tourism is booming. Foreign investment is cautious but present. And Erdogan, still in power, is now in his third decade of leadership and shows no signs of stepping down. He has sacked central bank heads, he has restructured institutions to follow his vision, he has crushed opposition when needed, and rallied his base with masterful timing. But time is a tricky thing. You can delay economic gravity for a while through control, manipulation, even charisma, but eventually something has to give. So far, Erdogan has bet that the world needs Turkey more than Turkey needs the world. But if inflation returns, if allies lose patience, if another currency crisis erupts, this time there may not be a soft landing, because behind the speeches, the flags, and the power moves, the average Turkish citizen is tired of volatility, of price shocks, of being proud but broke. And that's the real danger. I left Turkey with mixed feelings. It's a breathtaking country with warm people, deep history, stunning cities. But it's also a country caught in a storm of its own making. It wants to be rich, but on its own terms, respected without following the rules, powerful without playing anyone else's game. And that, in a way, is the ultimate gamble, not just with interest rates, but with identity itself. Until then, Erdogan rolls the dice.